Holly Joseph, and I am the Director of the Centre for Literacy and Multilingualism at the University of Reading, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's talk. Probably many of you have already attended some previous CeLM events, but in case you haven't, I'll just say a few words about CeLM and what we do. So we conduct research in the field of literacy and multilingualism. We engage with practitioners and the general public, and we train the next generation of researchers working within the field. And we have 5 interconnected research themes within our research centre, which are language and literacy, migration, health, cognition and neuroscience, and education. And today's talk is within the theme of education, although it certainly touches on other themes as well. And Professor Suzanne Graham, is one of our theme leads for education, and she has invited our speaker, Professor Carmen Munoz, today to speak. So I'll hand you over to Suzanne in a moment, but first let's do just a tiny amount of housekeeping. So I think I've muted everyone's microphones, but if you find yours isn't muted, please do keep it muted throughout the talk, and your cameras off during the talk. Because we're recording today's event, and when we post it on YouTube, it looks it's much easier for people to watch if people other than the speaker have their cameras off. So Carmen will speak for around 45 minutes, and throughout that time, please feel free to post questions or comments in the chat, and then we'll read out and ask some of those questions to Carmen afterwards. As I mentioned, tonight's event is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel in the next few days. I'll post a link to that towards the end of the talk. So I think that's all from me. So I'll pass over to Suzanne now to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Holly. So I'm Suzanne Graham from the University of Reading, and I'm really delighted to introduce today's speaker, who really doesn't need much introduction, I would say. So Professor Carmen Munoz from the University of Barcelona is very well known in a number of fields, and her work has certainly influenced my own work. So at the University of Barcelona, she's coordinator of the Language Acquisition Research Group, GRAL, and her research interests extend across a range of areas. So from longitudinal development of young learners learning English in Spanish schools from grade 1 to grade 7, to the role of age, input and aptitude in second language learning, and a third area, which is what she's going to be talking about today, which is language learning through audio-visual input. So I'm going to hand over to Carmen without further ado, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you, Carmen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Susan. And thank you, everybody, for attending the session. What I'm going to be talking about, as Susan said, is maybe the latest interest, let's say, in my professional life. I've been, for the last decade, me together with my colleagues at the GRAL group at our lab at the University of Barcelona, have been researching on learning through viewing. And this is what I'm going to be talking about, and I'm going to share some of the studies and some of the findings. I would like to begin by saying that the research that we've done has 3 distinguishing characteristics as compared to most research in this area. One is that we've tried to have as many longitudinal studies as possible, studies that took place in real classrooms over weeks or months or even academic years, in comparison with many studies in this area, which are just experiments that take place in one session. And you'll see that that it is important to have these extended studies in this area as in all other areas. And of course, it has much more ecological validity. We've also, as always, tried to include participants, not just university students, but also younger participants, adolescents and primary school learners. which is very challenging, more and more so. And also we've tried to look at different dimensions of language, not just vocabulary and comprehension, which is what most of the studies have looked at, but also grammar, pronunciation, and pragmatics. So those of you who are familiar with some of my work know that input has been an important concern for me, because of the input limitations that we have observed in schools, also in relation to age, right? How young children are so limited in the input that they cannot really benefit from much advantage. Exposure to the foreign language in typical classrooms is limited in quantity. Also, the distribution that has been called drip feed does not seem to be the best type of distribution for learning a language. And it's also limited in terms of quality and authenticity. So just to give an example, with vocabulary, we know that a learner needs around 3,000 word families to understand spoken discourse, around 8,000, 9,000 to understand written discourse, and that learners are unlikely to learn all these words in the classroom. That's why extensive reading has been advocated for a while. But even with extensive reading, it may be difficult to get the 3,000 words needed to understand spoken discourse. Not to mention that young generations are not very interested in reading in general, right? So that's a problem, how to supplement and complement classroom input. And this is what fueled my interest, our interest into this area. For the last 1-2 decades, children, adolescents, adults, everybody has many more exposure opportunities to be in contact with the target language and to learn a language. Web coined the term extensive watching, right, as parallel with extensive reading, as a recommendation for teachers to guide students outside the classroom to use their leisure time while watching to also learn a language. The other thing is that, as I included in the title, we don't need to do much convincing because they are already doing it. Yeah, today's young people live in a predominantly visual world, and they are exposed to digital stimuli more than ever. Back in 2001, Prensky referred to them as native speakers of the digital language of internet, gaming, etc. So if we use audiovisual media in the classroom, this aligns very well with the use of audiovisual media outside the classroom, which makes sense. Some of the characteristics of audiovisual input you have here on the screen. Audiovisual input in the classroom is adaptable to different ages of your learners, different characteristics. It is authentic input. It is relevant. You can make it relevant for autonomous learners also, right? They will choose that material which is relevant to their needs, to their interest. It is engaging, as we all know. It is unlimited, right? And the two most important characteristics are that it is comprehensible and that it is multimodal. We don't need to go back to Krashen to know that we acquire language when we understand what we hear and what we read. Yeah? And we have here this picture from a film where we can see from the visual image what it is about, right? What is happening here? So we have the image, we have the audio, and in this case also we have the captions. Audiovisual input is comprehensible and it's also multimodal. There are different theoretical frameworks that explain the benefits that we get through viewing. For example, the dual code theory by Paivio looking at how input modes are processed differently, but they interact and reinforce one another, or the cognitive theory of multimedia learning by Mayer, who stated something as simple as that people learn better from words and pictures than from words alone, or more recently from cognitive psychology, the concept of multimodal enrichment with multiple sensory modalities over unimodal processing. There have been a number of studies, many of them recent, about the benefits for learning. Most of them, as I said before, have looked at vocabulary and listening comprehension. We have 2 meta-analyses already in the field, and initially we had one by Montero Perez in 2014 with fewer studies, but now we have another one in 2022 with many more studies. Again, both of them confirming that watching, viewing audiovisual material conduces to vocabulary and listening comprehension gains. There are some studies that looked at these benefits when we have subtitles in the first language, and they mostly show that this is convenient or effective for learners with a low proficiency level. But most studies these days are looking into captions, that is L2 subtitles, when the text on the screen matches the language of the audio. And here we have multiple studies with multiple benefits. For example, seeing that it helps captions help speech segmentation, that captions facilitate identification of word boundaries, association of oral and written forms, visual auditory input, form meaning mapping, etc., etc. So at the GRAL group, we started this subtil project, that's subtitles in language learning, a few years ago, and we've had different funding for different phases of this long project by now. And what I wanted to share with you today are findings from recent studies that I'm going to organize into different chapters, in different sections. I thought it would be interesting to talk about young learners, about the different about research on different language dimensions, about the effect or the interplay, the role of learner individual differences. I will also say a few words about viewing conditions and also a couple of methodological considerations. So with primary school students, the challenge we've been examining these last years is how to use captions, because they usually have low proficiency level and the tendency maybe to use L1 subtitles, but we know that captions are more effective than L1 subtitles. So we've now conducted some nice studies with primary school students using captions. One concern is that, of course, if you are running an experiment, you can manipulate captions, you can simplify the language, you can simplify the audio, you can make the pace slow, etc. But we've always tried to, or almost always, to not manipulate the material so it is sustainable. We are looking at things that are sustainable for busy teachers and parents who are not going to be manipulating videos for the children. We've also tried to look for adequate material, and we found that children's cartoons seem to be adequate because the simpler language, of course, but also because of the short length. And of course, a concern with captions is the reading skills of children, right, which are still developing. So we've also paid attention to reading skills recently. This is one of the studies. You will see today many studies with the parenthesis with forthcoming, because this is a volume we are preparing. I think we have to send it this week, but it's coming. So many of the studies I'm going to be mentioning are from that book, which collects the most recent studies, as I said. So this was a PhD by Montserrat Casulleras, and she had 5th and 6th graders who viewed 20 episodes of Curious George, half of them with L1 subtitles and half of them with captions. They viewed one every week for 5 months. And what she found was that the subgroup that viewed that cartoon with captions had higher vocabulary gains at the end of the 5 months. Those who viewed it with with L1 subtitles, had higher comprehension, right? She had to test vocabulary and comprehension after each episode, but also that results were episode dependent. And this is interesting methodologically, because sometimes, or very often, we have studies that just take place in one session. So depending on the episode that these children saw, we had different results. And I think this is an important characteristic. Some methodological caution has to be taken here. This is another study, second study with primary school learners. Here we had 3rd graders and 5th graders, and they watched 11 episodes of Charlie and Lola twice every week, 2 every week. And here we distributed them into a group that watched the cartoons, the audiovisual material, with enhanced captions. So the target words were enhanced, were marked in yellow, and a group that just watched it with regular captions without enhancement. What we found was that those who watched with enhanced captions had an advantage, again, in vocabulary gains over those who watch it with regular captions. And interestingly, we could compare the results in this study with the results in another previous study by Abello, where she used exactly the same material with similar age and similar proficiency students, but she had post-viewing activities. So it wasn't totally incidental. There were post-viewing activities, so the children knew that there was going to be a task after viewing every time. And we found that the scores of the enhanced group in Fingerbow's study were very, very similar to the scores of the children in Abello's study with post-viewing activities. So they are both ways of drawing the attention of the children to the target words. In this study, we also use eye tracker to follow their eye movements into different episodes. In episode 3, which was right at the beginning, but once they were already familiarized with the intervention, and then in episode 11, which was the last one. And something that was surprising, we weren't expecting it, was that whereas in episode 3, the children who watched the enhanced captions had much longer fixation durations on the target words that were enhanced than those who watch it with regular captions. Whereas when we looked at what they did in episode 11, that difference had disappeared, right? So we found that this effect of caption enhancement was short-lived, which again has a methodological relevance, I think. From the study by Casulleras, we also learn about the effect of reading skills. Yeah? You remember I said just now that the study had 5th and 6th graders, and they watched 20 episodes of Curious George. And what Montse Casulleras found was that L1 reading skills were associated with video comprehension among the participants who watched the videos with subtitles, which makes sense. But Abello went beyond that and looked at the effects of viewing on reading skills, because reading captions gives children more reading practice. So when we looked at the results, we saw that caption viewing had improved the children's reading efficacy, measured in terms of speed of reading, silent reading speed and comprehension, not just for L2 reading, but also for L1 reading. And they were not reading in L1, they were reading in the L2, they were having captions. Okay, so this experience of watching just 11 episodes of a cartoon had positive effects on their reading skills, both in the L2 and in the L1. So we see in these studies that reading contributes to second language learning through viewing, but also that viewing enhances reading. So we go to examine this claim that has been around for some time, the claim to turn on the L1 subtitles to help children reading in the L1, as a supplemental literacy tool in many parts of the world. And studies have seen that reading in the L1 while listening to the L1 has many positive effects on reading, enhancement of phonemic awareness, vocabulary enrichment, comprehension, among many others. So together with the claim concerning the L1 subtitles, we can now add and turn on the captions, right? Again, a supplemental literacy tool, and reading in and listening to the L2 also has benefits parallel to reading in the L1. I move now to looking at different language dimensions, research that we have conducted in relation to different language dimensions. This is a quite complex study, it looks like, but very nice, by Georgia Pujadas. This was also a PhD. The intervention here, again, longitudinal. All the studies we've seen so far, as you can see, were longitudinal. And in this case, it took place in a whole academic year. So there were 8 sessions per term, a total of 24 sessions distributed into 10 months. And she had 4 groups of learners. 2 of them watched the episodes with subtitles in the L1, and 2 of them with captions in the L2. And 1 in each of the groups had a previewing task where they were taught target words, 5 target words, and 5 did not. So we were comparing both the effect of the language on the screen, but also the effect of having a pre-task before viewing. And this is like a nice summary of what we found. For vocabulary, right, we looked at both vocabulary and comprehension. For vocabulary, those who had the previewing task did better, much better. And for comprehension, those who did not have the previewing task did also better, slightly better. Yeah. So it looks like having to pay attention to those words that had been introduced in the previewing task somehow overloaded the capacities for comprehension as well. So we call it focus and unfocus because we are not happy with calling it incidental and intentional, because they are never totally intentional or totally incidental. But with a focus condition, that is with a previewing task, we found benefits, as I said, for word learning, but not so much for comprehension. And with the unfocused condition, just the opposite. For captions and L1 subtitles, what we found was that those who watched with captions learned more words, and those who watch with L1 subtitles had better scores in the comprehension tests. I moved to grammar. Grammar there's only been a handful of studies so far all around looking at grammar. There were a few studies like 20 years ago almost that did not show any benefits for grammar from viewing, but they were just, again, one session, and it is very difficult to learn grammar in just one session. So in this study, Anastasia Patemore had also a longitudinal study where they watched 2 videos every week for 5 weeks. In this case, they were young adults, they were university students. And in different studies, she had 3 groups, one who watched with captions, one without captions, and one with enhanced captions. And what we found was that those who watched with captions, again, did better in learning grammar than those who watched without captions. So what we learned for grammar is that captions were better than no captions, that enhanced captions were better than captions in the immediate post-viewing task. However, in a delayed post-test, the situation reversed. So we thought that probably there was an overload because there were too many enhanced grammatical constructions. So more research is needed here, clearly. In this study, we also had students with 3 very, very wide apart proficiency levels. So we could look at elementary, intermediate, and advanced level. And we found that benefits were larger for those with an intermediate level of proficiency, more than elementary or advanced. And also in this study, we looked at working memory of the participants. And again, we found something that was very interesting, because only those students, only those learners in the uncaptioned group, only for them, working memory scores predicted their post-test score in grammar learning. Yeah, but that was not the case with the caption group, with those who had the support of captions and did not need so much their working memory abilities. So what we learned from this study, several studies on grammar, grammar can also be learned through the visual input. As Susan Gass wrote, in terms of what type of learners can benefit the best, it looks like an intermediate level, always in consonance, in relation with the, of course, the lexical difficulty of the video that they are watching, right? So a zone within which captions are most useful, centered where the content difficulty level is not too far above or below a learner's ability level. We also saw that when there were no captions, so there were only 2 channels, not 3, there were not text on the screen, there were higher demands for working memory in the uncaptioned condition. And what we can see when looking at different studies, also looking at grammar with different duration, is that those which are longer, right, a longer longitudinal study, have more benefits for grammar. So it looks like we could conclude that for grammar, we need much more exposure to learn through viewing incidentally than to learn words incidentally through viewing. Pronunciation. The studies we have conducted on pronunciation start from the premise that learners are going to prioritize meaning and comprehension when viewing captioned video over phonological form, right? And that incidental learning of pronunciation is less likely to happen. So the 3 main studies we have on pronunciation we've always tried to focus learners' attention on pronunciation, right? So they are not mostly incidental, but mostly intentional. In this study, in Mora and Faust Gonzalez, what they did was to instruct learners to pay attention to a vowel contrast in English that is quite difficult to learn by Spanish learners of English. And what they did, which was a novelty, was to look at different enhancement techniques. So what instead of just enhance the vowels that they wanted to the learners to learn to perceive the contrast, they marked them in different colors, what they call contrastive enhancement input. And they also use phonetic symbols in the captions as enhancement techniques. The intervention, this one was a one-off, only 30 minutes, but even after only 30 minutes, they could observe gains in processing speed that were larger than gains in accuracy. Probably they would have needed a longer time to have gains in accuracy as well. And they also found, which is interesting, that even the control group that did not have captions also had a positive effect from the viewing, yeah, for the perception of the vowel contrast. Another study, also a PhD here, departed from the observation that high proficiency participants fixate on target words, as seen through an eye tracker, much earlier than the auditory onset, while low proficiency participants fixate on words much after. So with the idea that it would be ideal to have an audiovisual integration where you read the word at the same time as you heard it, yeah. Valeria Galimberti tried different ways of audio synchronizing the input. So, for example, what she did was to enhance the word that they were going to hear 500 milliseconds or 300 milliseconds before the auditory onset. Yeah? And what in this experiment, what she found was that this textual enhancement had an equalizing effect on participants' fixation distance, right? Most participants fixated on the target words right before the auditory input, which is what was looked for. And that level out the effect of proficiency and reading speed among the learners. So what we learned from the studies on pronunciation was that besides benefits for speech segmentation and processing skills, we found benefits for perception using contrastive input enhancement, benefits for production, either with a focus, again, being more intentional without captions or having captions without a focus and phonetic form, because having the two captions and focus and phonetic form, again, seems to overload learners' cognitive capacities. And as I just mentioned, how audio synchronized input levels out proficiency and reading speed differences. And last, Julia Baron and other colleagues have also looked at pragmatics, how audiovisual material can be used in the classroom to help students learn the pragmatics of the target language. And most studies that they've conducted have been concerning requests, right? How to learn to make requests in English always. They found that, again, when separating into two conditions, caption or uncaption, those with captions learned learned more pragmatics, right? The caption condition was more efficient because probably they support comprehension, and that frees cognitive resources that you can use to also notice the pragmatic aspects, to also notice the interaction. In this latest study, they've looked at the retrospective interviews of the participants, which also adds some qualitative information about how they perceive the acquisition of pragmatics through the visual material. And it looked like there was they all agreed that it was very important to be guided to acquire pragmatics of the target language. I move now to learner individual differences that we've looked at in some of the studies I showed, but also in other studies. 3 of them, 4 of them, 5, we have examined mostly. What we've seen in all vocabulary studies is that, as in reading studies, as in the Matthews paradox, the rich get richer, right? The larger the vocabulary size of the learner, the more words they learn, also through viewing, as it has been found also for reading, exactly the same. Also, those learners who had larger prior vocabulary size had a more reading improvement in various studies. And although Galimberti added a vocabulary size as one of the factors that she examined in her studies on pronunciation, she found that vocabulary size did not have a significant influence on pronunciation learning, right? Both very specific. It's not a general advantage. For proficiency, an issue could be what thresholds we have at the bottom and at the ceiling for learning through viewing. It looks like an A2, B1 could be a right level to begin, as has been recommended, particularly for autonomous learning. We can do other things in the classroom. At the top level, a study we conducted with Georgia Pujadas, we looked at what level of proficiency captions started being redundant. And it was not until C1, or in some cases C2, that captions were redundant. That is, that the group with captions or the group without captions didn't matter whether they had captions or not in understanding and in learning vocabulary when there was no pre-teaching. And this is also interesting from a more anecdotal type of thing, because I know many people here that tell me, oh yes, I'm watching Netflix in English or whatever language I am learning. But I do it without captions, without subtitles, because that's the way to learn, right? So people have this misconception that to learn better, to learn more, you do not want to have on-screen text. Whereas what all the studies find is that you learn more if you have the right kind of support on screen when you are up to intermediate or even high intermediate level. I didn't add a slide for age. I had one, but deleted it because the thing with age is that there is this confound with proficiency. So what we found when we've compared different groups with different age is that the older learn better, the older learn more vocabulary, or the older learn more grammar, or the older learn more pragmatics. Yeah. And but of course, those that are younger have lower proficiency level, lower vocabulary size, etc., etc. I mentioned before working memory in the study by Anastasia Patemore, where we saw that working memory was only significant for uncaptioned viewing, not for captioned viewing. We have replicated this result with language learning aptitude, which we have measured through LAMA, or different, either the whole LAMA or subtest in LAMA. And we found exactly the same, that no matter which subtest of LAMA we use, it is only significant for uncaptioned viewing, not for captioned viewing. And even in a study in vocabulary, we saw that it was significant for learning word meaning, but not for learning word form, right? Always the more challenging condition is the one in which either working memory or aptitude seems to emerge as significant, as predictive of learning. I move now to talk about viewing conditions. And here I've put together several findings that concern how we view this audiovisual input. One is the type of text that we have on the screen. As I already said, studies comparing captions with L1 subtitles, unless those studies that looked at very basic proficiency, those learners who watch with captions do better than those who watch with L1, except for comprehension, as we saw, but yes, for vocabulary or grammar, and better than those who do not have any kind of textual support on the screen. Now we are conducting a study. We are analyzing the data now, where we've also had a condition with dual subtitle, that was English and Spanish. And we've so far looked only at comprehension, and it looks like our students who were pre-adolescents and with low proficiency really look much more at the L1 subtitles than at the L2 English subtitles, of course. But we are going to be looking at vocabulary gains, and we'll see what the differences are between dual subtitles and captions or L1 subtitles. So this is another area of research that seems very interesting these days. Another study and another line of research that would need much more research concerns repetition of the audiovisual material. This is something that teachers do often. They use a video in the classroom and watch it twice, maybe in the same session or a few days later. So it seems like repetition is something that brings benefits for learning through viewing. And then one relevant question is whether this repetition is better to have right after the first exposure or spacing it, like leaving a week in between. And that's what we did in a study. And we found some advantage for space repetition. That it was repetition a week later. But there are different lags, different spaces between repetitions that could be examined, and also, of course, it will depend on the type of material, the complexity, and the learner's proficiency, etc. The issue of caption enhancement, again, is very interesting. As I said before, it looks as if it has a short-lived effect, and we need to look into that, because this also has repercussions for the classroom if the teacher wants to enhance certain target words or morphemes or sounds or whatever. So this has a practical interest. It is interesting that caption enhancement has been considered, and maybe should be considered more a semi-incidental condition than an incidental condition. So also the whole area of incidental and intentional learning through viewing needs much more exploration. We've seen that whenever we have either previewing or post-viewing activities or both, there are more gains than just incidental, of course, but we already knew that, not from viewing, from general SLA. We've had another recent study where Margarita Popova has compared using language reactor to an immediate repetition, both in an intentional learning scenario. And of course, here we learned a lot about how learners use language reactor and their reactions to using language reactor, which were very positive. And I will finish with some methodological considerations, just one really. As I said at the beginning, I think it is very important that we conduct longitudinal studies in addition to also one-off studies. There are studies that can only have one session, but having longitudinal studies is very important. We have seen in more than one study that results, as I mentioned before, may be episode dependent. So comprehension is different even within the same series, right? Where the characters are the same and the complexity of the vocabulary in general is the same. Maybe the content matter is more difficult, whatever. So we can see that if we had used one episode instead of another and just having a one-off session, we would have had different results. So we have to really be careful with our studies here. A second consideration, I was just mentioning it, was the fleeting effect of enhancement. Another consideration also in favor of having longitudinal studies is that we have noticed an effect of habituation, so that in these longitudinal studies, for example, the difference between L1 and L2, or the difference between having subtitles at all and not having subtitles, comes not after 2 or 3, but maybe after 10 sessions. And as I also mentioned before, we've also seen that for studies, if we want to really see how people can learn grammar and pronunciation through viewing, we need the studies where we give learners great exposure time, longer than for vocabulary. Learning words seems to be much easier in a shorter session. So summarizing, we found lots of evidence of learning benefits for different linguistic aspects. We can also see that we've seen the interplay of different factors: proficiency, age, cognitive individual differences, the language of subtitles, exposure time, right? It's, again, of course, it's a multi-factor situation, and we have to look at all of those, or most. We've seen that captions mitigate the effects of individual differences. They mitigate the effects of proficiency. They mitigate the effects of working memory, of aptitude. They also mitigate the effects of word frequency. We have here a whole range of studies that we can do, from more incidental to more intentional learning, using pre and post tasks, using instructions, using captions, using enhanced captions, using repetition, language reactor, etc. And that all this universe has multiple applications for the classroom and for autonomous learning, because we have this duality here. We have the more incidental learning while viewing, while we can also have, for the same learner, viewing for learning at different points. And I had here a list of further research. Some of them I already mentioned, some I didn't. One is the affective dimension, looking at the learner engagement, viewer engagement with the audiovisual material. Looking at cognitive styles, we may find differences there. There is some research, but not much. I mentioned the study of the lag in between and the spacing in between. So it would be good to find optimal lags, optimal spacing between repetitions. As I said, we need to look at the long-term effects of enhancement. And this has a more general interest, not just for viewing studies. Also within intentional learning, we would like to find which tasks allow for deeper processing and then more learning, etc., etc., etc. Thank you very much for listening, viewing, and reading.
Thank you, Carmen. What a body of work. Do we have any questions?
So there aren't any in the chat. We've got a hand up though, Susanna, I think.
Yeah.
So Carmen, maybe if you want to stop sharing your screen, so that you can see all of us. So okay, that's good. Yeah. So Susanna, do you want to come on mic and put your question to Carmen?
Yeah, I think I did. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's great.
Okay, thank you very much. This is very interesting talk. I'm very much into pronunciation and pronunciation teaching, and just wanted to ask for a few clarification questions, maybe that. So in the studies you mentioned by Mora and Foth, so there was no incidental learning in the sense that they did have some pre-instruction. So the difference was whether it was like highlighting the contrastive segments or whatever phonological differences or phonological contrast they wanted to show, but haven't really said whether there was really any gain in those who had a contrastive, like highlighting, or just had the pre session. Yeah, so that's one thing. And my other question is linked to that how did they measure the development of pronunciation? Because I think it's a bit probably more difficult to measure exactly than like vocabulary gain or something.
Okay. The second question, and I'll come back to the first. They didn't measure production, they measured reception. They had reception tasks. Yeah. And for the first question, they had 6 groups, 6 conditions, and 4 with different types of input enhancement, either contrastive or non-contrastive, orthographic symbols and orthographic symbols. And then they had 2 control groups, one who watched the video without any contrastive, without captions, and one who didn't watch the video. Yeah, so a pure control group. And then your question was, and they all
so what were the, so then
they all had the instruction to look at that vowel contrast. So yes, it was totally
okay.
The intention was that it was intentional. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So no pure. Okay.
Yeah.
And which one had the biggest gain of all these 6?
The ones with contrastive in enhancement, but also the ones with it depend. They had 5 different tasks, I think. I wasn't personally, so I'll be less concrete here. But they didn't find exactly the same results for all the tasks. So for most of the tasks, it was the color contrast that produced more gains, but also the orthography symbols also showed large gains. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else with a question? I have one if no one else has one. Can I ask mine? Is that allowed? So
Yeah.
Carmen, I was really interested in, you said a couple of times about episode specific, that gains were related to specific episodes, and at the end you said that you did, they had similar content, similar vocabulary. I mean, do you think it is related to learner engagement? The more enjoyable, the more interesting, or
It could.
huh.
It could. Yeah, I said maybe the theme of the topic. Yeah, the thing is, in this study I mentioned now with dual subtitles also, we use 4 documentaries from exactly the same series of documentaries, having looked at lexical coverage, which was very, very similar in the 4. And one of the documentaries clearly was different from the other 3, right? In the other studies I mentioned, when mentioning the word episode, is because for these longitudinal studies, we've always used a series, a TV series, because then they are familiar with the characters and they can follow much better everything, right? But then that's why I said episode. Even within the same series, some seem, yeah, maybe there was a topic there that they didn't engage so much with. We will see in this last study what if because we had a questionnaire afterwards asking for levels of engagement with the different documentaries. We'll see if we can find something there. But I think that's interesting because of the problem that sometimes we have studies that are beautiful studies, but have used, imagine you choose just one of those episodes.
Yeah.
And in one
indeed.
of the episodes, there was a significant difference among the 2 groups that we were looking at. And in another episode, there wasn't. When we look at all the episodes, we see there is a significant difference. But when we look at each one of the episodes, in some of them, there's no significant difference. And in some there are. So if you only use one or the other, you may conclude different things, which would not be very valid.
No, indeed not. Okay.
Thank you.
Anyone? Thank you. Any more questions?
There is one question in the chat. In the
chat. Okay. Ruth, you talked about the impact experimentation of dual subtitles. Were there any parts of the study that identified the dual L1s or bilingualism of learners if English is L3 as an influential factor?
No, we didn't. I suppose I could justify it by saying that they are very balanced bilinguals, but this is something we could see. When we've looked at things like this, we haven't found differences among the learners we work with, which are in the area of Barcelona, where Spanish is very much extended, and Catalan as well, because it's the language of the school. Maybe if we move to places in Catalonia itself where there was much more Catalan, there was a dominance for Catalan, we may find some differences, if that's what the question was about. But yeah, we could look at it. That would be not dual. We could have triple subtitling. Too much, maybe.
Yeah, maybe overload. Okay, I think you've given us so much information and food for thought. It was really.
Maybe there was too much information.
No, it was really comprehensive, and it left more or less everything. Nothing was left unanswered, I think, is the conclusion maybe to that. So perhaps if we can all express our thanks to using the React tool, but really that was really wonderful and really fascinating, and I know that I learned a lot. And yes, we're very much looking forward to the book, the publications. That would be wonderful.
There's some there, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Carmen. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And we'll say bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.